Oh, tomorrow.
Tomorrow
Okay.
morning, yeah, indeed, yeah.
Cool.
But a lot of while I said I made the same presentation in the Korea.
Ah.
So because as far as I can see, most of the people here were not on Korea, so I think it's fine. But then I will explain how to.
The core area was from core reviewers, yeah.
Yeah, I only saw a few of them, so yeah. Cool. Okay, and so you will be discussing about the
policy.
policy. Yeah, indeed.
Cool. Pretty good. Pretty good.
If you
Okay.
Enjoying it? The whole event
Yeah.
in your native land.
Well, yes, yes, it is. But I'm a bit jet lagged. I don't know why. No, actually, I'm tired. I don't know. Yeah.
When did you come up from Europe, Grenoble? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm from Grenoble, so
Yeah.
basically I took one
So
train.
it's basically two full laps.
Yeah.
And I was fortunate. I was having a speed train from Lyon directly to Massy.
Ah, pretty good. And the
one
Generative AI station in
Yeah,
Marseille.
because in between Lyon and Nantes,
Yeah.
Nantes or Rennes, basically it goes by Massy.
Okay.
So that's why in general people can go to the west.
Yeah.
From Lyon, like for example for Martin,
I just don't care enough
within Strasbourg.
Okay.
He was also able to go back to. It was able to go to Massy directly because in between Bordeaux and here, then
Yeah.
it's for Massy. So
We
yeah,
should do-
basically the Massy station is a
Very good.
Yeah, it's a good one. Yeah.
We should do more events here. And take advantage of your wonderful trains. So we had a meet up in the patrol office
Okay.
Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday before the event.
Um,
The first time I've been there. Have you been there? It's in La Défense. It's like it's Paris, but it's not really Paris.
no,
It's kind of, yeah,
no, I haven't seen that.
quite nice. It's quite
Okay.
nice, yeah. So definitely good for a meetup. Like if you guys are doing a compute team meetup or something like that, the obvious place to do is somewhere like Grenoble, right? But you know, Paris would be a good alternative.
No, yes, indeed. I mean, I know Paris. I was seeing Paris a few times before, but like a few years before, I didn't went to Paris for like a few years.
Yeah.
But yeah, indeed, it's a good one. But at least for our team, we will see us, about that.
Yeah.
And, like into not 2 weeks, but like into on December.
In December you go to Grenoble. Yeah. I'm just saying for future years, right?
Oh, cool.
Because we tend to really focus a lot of our meetups on Grenoble, right? And it's not for everybody. It's actually quite awkward to get there. I think Jean Uni refuses to ever talk about it.
Well, I can also have this.
Yeah. Hey JP, how are you? Thanks for joining. Did you meet Sean in your travels?
Eh?
Did you meet Sean in your travels?
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I think he's going to attend the law. Cool. Want to give it a few minutes?
I think we still have like 20 minutes now.
It's a full hour, actually.
At the top of the hour?
Yeah.
Okay, then.
It's actually a double section.
Oh, yeah.
It's such an interesting topic. One section wouldn't do.
Oh, you're right. It's like in 4 minutes.
Hello. Welcome.
Hello. I want to show
That's right.
Anyone having trouble with the Wi-Fi? Getting good Wi-Fi access or?
If you can't get on the Open Infra one
Right.
from here, because it's out of range, if you connect to the guest, it gives you a 60-minute free pass and emails you a permanent login.
Oh, okay.
So
Cool.
it's actually,
Okay.
just use the guest. It'd be
Okay.
great. And I totally read the terms and conditions and found out you don't have to be a student working.
I'm glad you did that, Jay. 'Cause I
Yeah, I 100% promise I did,
Yeah.
just like I've read the AI policy, which I actually did read. Even though
Good man. Not just the introductory paragraph, the whole thing.
I actually did read the whole thing of the AI policy.
Good man.
Not a sentence of the terms and conditions for the guest Wi-Fi.
Cool. So your input in this session will definitely be valuable. So, is that the feeling? Not everybody got to the very end of that policy.
I was telling some folks that I was really glad that y'all came up with one, because when people on my team were asking if it was okay or not,
Yeah.
I was glad that my personal opinion didn't have to go into the matter, because it didn't matter how I felt about AI.
Mm-hmm.
What mattered is smart people who actually did the research determined what was okay.
Cool. Well, you know, if we put the label smart on us all, but people did anyway. People did the research. Yeah.
I mean,
There was a smart lawyer involved, which is good. Chris Stevenson. So.
someone smart had to call the lawyer, and that was a smart move.
Cool. So we'll give it a couple minutes, see if anyone else shows.
Yeah.
Hello, folks. Bernard, Martin, thanks for joining. How did your session go, Martin? How did your session go?
Pretty well.
Well, yeah, pretty good. Was it recorded?
I think they're all recorded.
Okay.
There's a camera up there.
Yeah.
And mics somewhere.
Yeah.
We'll see. There will be a surprise.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, 'cause there's always so many sessions that you don't get to see, even though you'd like to. So it'd be nice to have that opportunity to catch up.
So are you presenting or is Gemini presenting?
Sorry?
Are you presenting or is
Well,
Gemini
Gemini, note the shameless self-referential plug there.
What I'm teasing you, not to know who's going to present.
No, I'll be presenting, but Gemini definitely was quite helpful in the production
was
of
Gemini's
these
idea.
slides. Right. So I think this is scheduled actually for 3:55, so it's just over an hour, so we don't have a full room as yet, but we can get started. So this is, obviously it's a forum session, right? So when I actually submitted it initially, it was for a normal kind of presentation-y style session. The program committee allocated a full hour for it, right? Because it's such a interesting topic, right? So I'll just use that deck maybe to set the scene first, and then we can revert to the normal kind of forum format, right? Etherpad, typing from your side, feedback from the room, suggestions, questions, all that kind of stuff, right? So if you don't know me, word of introduction, been around OpenStack for a long time, currently lead the OpenStack engineering team at Red Hat. For the purposes of this presentation, probably the important bit is member of the Foundation Governing Board, because a lot of this policy work came from the board originally, right? Quick caveat, I'm not claiming to be an expert in the use of AI-assisted software development tools, right? I've played around with these tools quite a bit, just for kind of hobby work, etc. But, in my role, I haven't used it professionally, right, day to day, right? So I would say very high likelihood that you all know more about the actual reality of using these tools than I do, right? So not here to propagandize, right, the use of AI. I'm more here to listen, get feedback, bring that feedback back to the board with the aim to make this policy better, more usable, more applicable. So that's the idea. Why am I interested in it particularly? Well, no secret that our contributor base has narrowed over the years. Right? If you were to, anyone who's been around OpenStack for a long time would have seen that. And it seems that it's an opportunity for us to kind of shore up the community health, right? By automating some of the more mechanical work that goes into what we do, right? Taking out some of the toil, giving us all a productivity boost, right? And absorbing essentially that shrinkage of the community base by adopting this tooling, right? So that's my interest in it, right? So full disclosure. And again, I'm here to listen and take on board opinions from the room. I'm not here to persuade you that AI is good or anything like that, because I know it's a controversial topic, right? So this is forum style. So as is traditional, I've got an Etherpad, right? Very easy URL, Par for Paris, good AI policy. So if you've got your laptop there, or your phone or whatever, if you could connect to that, you're looking for some input, and whatever we capture in the Etherpad, I'll be bringing that back to the board, right? So here's your opportunity to kind of have your voice heard if you have strong opinions on it. Okay, agenda. The original why for doing this session, right? So what the motivation was. We have actually been working on this AI policy for quite a long time at this point, right? So just a quick recap in how we got to here, right? Various steps along the way. Thrown a bit of data as to how widely or narrowly the AI policy has been adopted. And then the important bit is the bits in the red box, right? Because this is where you come in, right? And I'll shut up, right? And I want your opinions, right? So what are the blockers, right? So what particular things may be acting as an impediment for people to actually use the policy, right? What could we do better, to improve the actual wording or the constraints or the steers or the requirements or whatever in the policy that might make you more likely to use it, right? And then some potentially brainstorming around next steps, right? How might we go a bit further along this path in terms of, deeper usage of AI beyond just code generation, right? And there's lots of different possibilities there, and I've got a couple of ideas, but definitely interested in, what the temperature in the community would be around this. Okay, so the original one. So look at that wording. It's probably the very slow that I put in bold there. Probably a little harsh, right, in retrospect. And part of that is just the actual call for papers deadline was middle of June, if I remember correctly. And when I show some graphs later, you'll see that there was quite a noticeable uptick in the adoption of the policy after that point, right? So if I was writing this abstract again now, I probably wouldn't say very slow, right? But that's what I wrote back in June, right? And that's what's obviously in the schedule, right? So maybe it's slowish as opposed to very slow at this point. But the basic premise here is how would the governing board of the foundation know that it's doing a good job, right? What is the litmus test for goodness or fitness of any policy, right? And if that policy has to be adopted and used in a kind of voluntary way, well then the obvious litmus test is, do people use it or not, right? If people use the thing, it's a good thing, right? If people don't use the thing, well then we've got to kind of question whether it's a good thing or not, right? And whether we need to revise, whether we need to kind of listen for feedback and get some input, etc. Yeah, so that's what we're doing here. Getting input, getting more kind of from the ground, from the grassroots kind of directionality as to where we should bring this. Okay? So why do we even have a policy? Why do we even do this? Right? So I think, certainly this may have even started a bit earlier than Vancouver, but in my mind that's where significant interest in this really started to bubble up. Right? So that's about 2 years ago. I think it was like June, July of 2023. Right? So give or take a couple of months. It's about 2 years ago, right? There's a lot of chatter, I remember, in the hallways and in various presentations. And I'll have like a flashback slide next, right, from a deck that I presented, right? But obviously lots of people were talking about it at that point in time. There were some other open source software foundations, well-known ones, like the Eclipse Foundation, like the Apache Software Foundation, I think Linux Foundation even, right? They were getting into writing their own policies at that point in time, right? And in particular, one trend that was emerging was the importance of marking, quote unquote, right, contributions that were fully or partially AI generated, right? And there were kind of several reasons why that was seen as important, right? So one was maintaining kind of community trust, right? So if you're using an AI generated tool and you are basically imposing on the time of other people to review your code, right? Part of maintaining that trust is to just be upfront about it, right? Now, I wouldn't, see it in terms of fessing up to using AI. I personally just see it as a tool like any other, right? It's more just full disclosure. I've been assisted in this work by using a particular tool, and whoever is consuming your work can apply that as part of their kind of decision calculus, whether they'll invest time in it as well, right, by reviewing your code or whatever. So I think that's totally fair. It's also seen as important for risk mitigation, right? So in some future dystopian world, right, where there's a lot of problems with, say, IPR infringement or whatever from AI generated code, it would be nice if we were able to go back and identify all of the patches, right, that use particular AI tools, right? So that's what the risk mitigation part is, right? At that point in time, though, I think the tooling is still quite rough and ready, right? Anyone use GitHub Pilot, say, 2 or 3 years ago? Yeah? How nice was the experience at that point? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it was definitely, compared to now, right? I mean, chalk and cheese, like compared to, say, Cloud Code or something like that, right? However, you could see the trajectory, right? You can see that this was going on an upward curve. It was, it's a cliche that people often say, right, for AI tooling. What you're using today is the worst it's ever going to be, right? Is the rate of improvement that's just so rapid. I think even 2 years ago, when it was quite rough and ready, I think that rate of improvement, the path ahead was kind of big, right? And that was that generated interest, and of course, yeah, you can see it in 2 different ways: threat and opportunity, right? So a lot of people in the open source world, this is very clear, see it as a threat, right? Because we're all about the attribution, we're all about the the intellectual commons, right? And there's clearly a kind of a threat level here in terms of breaking the kind of bounds of trust that go along with sharing and properly attributing work and all that kind of stuff, right? But it's also an opportunity, and I kind of see it more on the opportunity end of the scale, right? Because, as time has gone on, we're a smaller community, right? So it'd be nice to be able to get more work done per person, right? And keep up with the rate, the demands of our time by just being more efficient. Okay. That's the flashback slide I promised, right? There was loads of this kind of stuff in Vancouver, if I remember. This is one that I had in a deck. I was talking about the community kind of evolution, yada yada, the challenges the community was facing, blah blah blah. But the important point is a bit at the end there. We're sort of talking about the potential for AI to be transformative, right? And for us to kind of dig ourselves out of a bit of a hole, right, in terms of just the available hands to get the work done, particularly by taking away some of the more mechanical stuff, right? And reducing the cognitive load while acknowledging the many, many challenges, right? So that was 2 years ago. Here's a timeline. The purpose of this slide really is to just really emphasize the fact we didn't rush into this, right? I think nobody could accuse us basically of over-rotating too fast, right? There's 2 years in that timeline, right? So September 23, I think, is when there was the first discussion on the foundation board mailing list about this, right? And then maybe we had, talks about it at the October board meeting. That's like literally a full 2 years ago, right? So we're definitely not just following the fad here, right? And it wasn't a knee-jerk reaction. I think it was very considered, kind of slow, deliberative, intentional process, right? So September 23, the Apache policy was out at that point. We started talking about it in the board. We had a good
long year or so, right, there was a lot of consultation, there were talks with the OpenStack Technical Committee, there was outreach to other kind of top level projects within Open Infra, right, and then finally in June of 24, the first version of the policy was published, and that was kind of, at that point it was quite, let me just do a time check, at that point it had, I think, gone through quite a heavy kind of amount of consultation. We also had legal review, right? So Chris Stevenson, who was a DSL Piper, the group of attorneys that work with the foundation, had given it a very strong review, and that was published in June of 24, right? So over a year ago, what's happened since? So excuse the very naff icons. That's Gemini's attempt to give it a sense of tumbleweeds kind of rolling along. Not very tumbleweed, thanks Gemini. But either way, in that period between June 24 and July of this year, very little happened, right? As in, very few patches were landed, right, that were attributed to AI. Like vanishingly low number, very close to zero, right? So we started noting that about spring of this year, right, started did a bit of data mining, noticed that there were very few patches. I think Jay, you might have had the only one that I found, right? There was one ironic patch, I think, at that point that had been landed, right? So very, very few, which kind of set me thinking, right, you know, this is a group of technologists who are normally early adopters of all things new and interesting in the technical space, right? Why isn't this policy being used, right? Have we kind of gotten it wrong at the board level in terms of how we crafted a policy, right? So we started another board discussion. We did some more consultation. There was a working group that Julia Kreger chaired. So a lot of this work, you know, kind of hat tip to Julia, and Alison Randall was probably the other major contributor within the board, right? So Julia started a further round of consultations, and a few things came up at that point, right? That led us to revise the policy, simplify it, right, and add a alternative commit message label, assisted by, right, as well as the original generated by, right? And that was July of this year that I think we voted on that as a board, right? So that took some data. Apologies for the color scheme here, right? This is Gemini, right, doing its thing. So how did I mine this data? I started with Garrett, right? There's rudimentary searching capability in Garrett, so it just doesn't cover just OpenStack. There was some starting, you know, kind of projects as well that showed up. Search for all usages of generated by or assisted by, right, after a certain date, after the policy had been introduced. And then kind of excluded everything, like people use generated by in other contexts as well, like in the middle of a sentence. Or there's some Zool tooling and there's some release management tooling as well, where typically people use the generated by label. So excluded all of those, right? And then you see the timeline, right? So the blue is generated by, green is the total. Initially, the blue and green are the same because there's only one commit label. And this is the tumbleweed period, right? So tumbleweed's bouncing along, right, until about here, new policies introduced, right? Bit of a hockey stick, right? Okay? So you can, they're in monthly bins, by the way. So that's like kind of, that's why October is less, right? Because when I grabbed this data, we were only a little bit into October, right? You can see the trend, I think, a bit better with the cumulative count, right? So you see, Gemini didn't use the same color scheme for these two graphs, which is not very helpful, but by the way. So in this case, the blue is the original generated by, see a very slow start, right, and then it ramps up. Whereas the assisted by, obviously zero here because it wasn't a thing, right, and it starts and it overtakes about here, right, and then the green is just the total of the two, right. So you can see the trend, which in my view is very positive, but the numbers are still quite low, right? Still less than 80 patches in total, right? Anyone want to guess? Oh, I didn't check this, right? But how many patches would you say are landed per cycle these days, right? Across all of the OpenStack projects and the Starling X and
Probably 5 figures.
probably, yeah. So 80, less than 80 out of 5 figures is a pretty small percentage, right? Even though again, trend looks a bit better than it did previously, right? So how can we do better, right? Oh, this is another interesting thing. The actual models people are using, right? So as you can see, what's the most interesting takeaway here is all of the Claudes, right, are completely dominant, 70% plus, right? Now there's lots of variation in that. Some people just say Claude Code. Other people say Claude Code with Sonnet 4.5 or whatever, right? But if you bucketize them all, 70%, right? Like when we started on this thing, Claude Code wasn't widely used. Similarly, Cursor, I'd never even heard of it, right? When we started on this work, right? That's beginning to come. Google's obviously all the Geminis, various ChatGPT variants, right? One person used Amazon Q Developer, right? So that was just one, right? They only used it once, right? And then the other, I think, are like JetBrains. Somebody used JetBrains Genie or something. That was you, Jay. Yeah. So always the original kind of taking your own path there, right? Now I only counted, by the way, just to be clear about the numbers, I only counted patches that landed on master branches, right? Because there was a lot of patches that, landed on master were also backported to 3 or 4 stable branches or whatever. So that would introduce a lot of duplication, right? And I only looked for, anything that was abandoned or hadn't been landed yet, I didn't count. So it's only things that had actually been reviewed and landed, right? So if we were to kind of widen it out and look for, patches still under review, we'd get a bigger number, right? But the interesting thing here, apart from the fact that Anthropic, right, people are voting with their feet for Claude Code, right, is in the original policy, this is something we debated on the board level quite a bit, right? We are a group of open source contributors, right? We tend to, bias towards open source things, right? We didn't want to be so restrictive as to say the only models you can use are open source models, right? But instead, there was a bit of a steer in there. It was like, where possible, please try to use open source or open weights models, right? I can't remember the exact message. How many open source or open weights models were used?
They're bad.
Exactly. That's why, Jeff. Yeah, precisely. They're bad, right? Now, if they're better, maybe we'd get a different number there, right? But precisely 0, right? Which is interesting. Okay, so what was holding us back? This is where you might want to kind of look at the Etherpad if you've got a laptop or whatever. So if you want to throw in some feedback here, so like this is the timeline that I talked about, how we did the consultation, yada yada, right? You're never going to keep everybody happy, but we probably could have done that better, right? We might have talked to a wider variety of people, right? We might have communicated more through the mailing list and maybe a bit less through meetings, right? That people can either hit or miss, right? People are available or not available, right? So anything that we could do better there as a board, right? Definitely please type, and I will bring that message back. And here's the piece I'm talking about now. What was holding us back, right? What are the impediments? Why wasn't this more warmly embraced by the community, right? There's a few that I've heard, right? So obviously we had all kinds of open discussions, and I had some one-to-ones as well with people in the Red Hat team who I knew were kind of grappling with this, right? I got some good feedback, right? I think one of the most interesting pieces of feedback I got initially was generated by is just too much, right? It carries too strong a message, and it kind of cedes too much agency to the tool, right? So essentially what you're saying is the tool did it, right? And I just pressed, some buttons, right, to submit the patch. That was it, right? And that's kind of the wrong message, right? Because that's not what tools do, right? They don't do the work for you. They just make the work easier, right? And more achievable, and more productive, and more efficient, yada, 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 right? So I think that may have been a misstep, right? So I was talking to Sean Mooney. I know various people came up independently with the same idea, but the first time I heard it was from Sean Mooney, who's one of the long-standing Nova and Watcher contributors. And Sean suggested assisted by, right, would be closer to the actuality of using these tools, right? So I think that was good call, and you can see in the trends here that once we did introduce the assisted buy option, you know, there was certainly a positive response in terms of people using it. Another point that people made a lot of was the policy itself was quite hard work to actually read through, right? It definitely had the fingerprints of the lawyers on it, right? And it had a lot of words, like just so many words, right? There was a lot of just description of what the terms meant and yada, yada, yada. Now, that was all totally well-intentioned, right? And the people who worked on that initial version on board were attempting to take as much care and be as complete as possible, right? But it turned out it was kind of off-putting, or it was seen as off-putting, right? So one of the ways we tried to mitigate that was just simple expedient of having a summary paragraph up front, which essentially set out the meat of it, right? Yes, you're allowed to use these tools. If you use them, please mark your contributions clearly using these commit labels. You know, if possible, you know, use models that are trained on in ways that are kind of compatible with our view of software licensing, yada, 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 right? Just a few lines to essentially grab the distillation of it. What else? I've heard this one. I mean, who does a lot of reviewing here? Yeah, Sivan, John, Jay. Yeah, okay, so your time is valuable, right? What's the limiting factor in any open source community? Is it the patches pushed, or is it the reviewers actually clustering them?
CI.
Apart from CI, right? Yeah. But the most kind of precious resource is usually reviewer time, right? And especially where there's a culture of fairly high scrutiny reviews, as we do, and you know, I think rightly so in our what happened there? I need to do something.
That's probably connection and wire something.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Or somebody connected with their.
Probably send the cable is disconnected.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's the black cable on the front. Maybe.
Still good on this one. No, on this one it's okay.
Okay.
So we can see
Try a black cable in the front.
Try the black cable.
Here.
Can you try the black cable?
Sure.
Oh, okay. Okay. I'll just continue talking. Hopefully we'll get the deck up again. Yeah, so reviewer stuff. I mean, this is a very obvious thing, right? If reviewer bandwidth is the limiting factor and you overwhelm reviewers with an absolute tsunami of AI generated patches, lower quality patches, that's not going to be good for the health of the whole kind of flow, right? So that was a very valid concern. I'm not a lawyer, right? I don't even kind of play one on TV or anything like that, right? But there are quite a few amateur lawyers in our open source community, right? And people were worried about, like, is this stuff even copyrighted, right? Like if a model autonomously generates alias, right? Cool, thank you, sir. If a model generates content, right, is that even licensable, right? So I think that's a valid question. The best answer I've heard has been from Richard Fontana, who's one of our colleagues at Red Hat, but you know, he's been around, certainly he was around the OpenStack community quite a lot in the early days, so a lot of you probably know. And the way Richard is kind of, I've heard him explain it, is that yes, if it was totally generated by AI, it wouldn't be copyrightable, but that's almost never the case, right? There's always some kind of taking these things, composing them, there's some kind of design process behind it, there's some kind of tweakage of the output of the model, right? And then I think quite a common thing that people brought up initially was, what if this model was trained on proprietary code? Is it possible it could regurgitate the exact code, right? It seemed to be like possible to do with earlier versions of GitHub Copilot, but you really had to coax it, right? You really had to kind of craft your prompt in an exact way, right, to get it. And it seems over the last couple of years that actually happens in a vanishingly rare amount of times, right? It's not as common as people feared, right, I think. But again, open to correction on that, and certainly there are ways of
I spent a good hour trying to get Copilot to generate ironic code to erase a disk.
Oh, very
and
good.
the code it generated was so bad, I wish it had stolen mine instead.
That's a good way of looking at it. Okay, but if you have any other, yeah, so that's kind of just my thoughts on it, right? Or what I've heard from other people. What's your thought on it? Like, what would stop you, or what has stopped you as a contributor in actually doing this, right? Other concerns? Like,
I guess
got it?
one of the concerns people have is that if they put assisted by label in their contribution,
Yeah.
that they will be people in the community will talk badly about them, or there will be a retaliation for having this assisted by in their contribution. So, like, I'm from the Fedora community, and we have kind of people who tolerate AI and people who actually do not tolerate AI, and that there's a risk that people exposing themselves through this assisted by label to some negative feedback on social networks or whatever it's happening.
Yeah. So it's kind of like you're risking reputational damage
Yeah.
amongst your peers. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a very fair point, and I think it ties in with this notion of having to fess up to the usage of AI tools, as if it was something kind of vaguely shameful, right? Like you wouldn't fess up to the usage of an IDE. You wouldn't say, okay, full disclosure, I went beyond Vim, right? And you know,
Yeah.
I used PyCharms or something like that, right? Like people wouldn't care, right?
I think it's important to set this attitude in the project level with some
Yeah.
authoritative figures on the project saying, yes, we actually like you using the tools if they help you, and this is
Yeah.
not a big deal.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a cultural thing, right? And that brings me to another point. I didn't, when I kind of call out individual projects, right? So I didn't actually put the other data I'd mined, with the help of Gemini. But as well as the relatively low usage of the commit labels, it's also very clustered on individual projects, right? So there's 2 or 3 projects, and we have a representative of one of them in the room, right, that are standout usage. Like you can see it, like just row after row after row in the spreadsheet, right, of a particular project. And then there's some projects that are just completely absent, right? And that maybe speaks to the culture, what you were talking about, Alexandra, about, it being seen in some projects as, I don't know, you're not quite up to snuff as a top-class open source contributor if you have to get this assistant, right? Now, personally, I don't buy into that because any way of doing better work faster is good, right?
I put this in the Etherpad as well, but I mean, you can tell those people straight up that literally a majority of OpenStack Ironic cores are using these tools, pushing them.
Yeah.
That includes me. I'm a former TC chair. It includes Julia, who is the current chair of the board.
Yeah.
Like, if people are going to judge them badly for using AI, I don't think that would be representative of the generally congenial nature of our community.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that message going out, the well-known people like yourself and Julia are using the tools, getting value from them, right, and are totally bought into it. I think that's very powerful, right? Very powerful
This
message.
leads to this assisted by being supposed to drive the exponential growth, because once some small groups of people start using it, it's easier for other people to also start using it. So the growth needs to be seeded by some active group at first, and then it will continue.
And it's kind of like a demonstration effect.
Yeah.
Right, yeah, absolutely. Emma, were you going to jump in?
Well, we also have a lot of projects at OpenStack that don't get as much attention as they should be, and do end up in a stage where it's just constant maintenance and no space for any new development. So using these AI tools to do some of that maintenance, that tedious stuff that you really don't want to do, can actually help attract and retain contributors, because it's not all boring stuff and there is time to do interesting problem solving in the projects.
Yeah, absolutely. And because you can't, like, say, typical examples of that might be backports, right? So if the relatively small project team, right, are focusing their energy on getting stuff designed, coded up, and landed on master, right, and then the more mechanical work is kind of handled behind the scenes, that would just free up more work for the higher value stuff. Absolutely. Jakob, is it?
Jacob. Yeah.
Jacob.
So, comment and a question. First, a comment on what you and Jay have said about Julia and others leading adoption. 100%. I've been experimenting with Claude and Cursor, but I wasn't quite confident enough to push patches for review. I started seeing the ones from Julia being merged. It's like, well, she's doing it. I guess I'm supposed to be doing this. So this is a really good way to increase adoption. 100%. I've been through this myself. Now, question. You mentioned that we're dealing with decreasing number of contributors. Is it an OpenStack problem or a general open source problem?
Yeah, that's a very good question, right? And I really only have direct data on OpenStack, right? But like in that session for Vancouver that I mentioned, right, I kind of mined a bunch of data from Stackalytics, right? And the trend was very, very clear, right? That in OpenStack, there was a peak reached at around maybe around 2016, 2017, I can't remember exactly when, and then there was a fairly long, slow, but very, clear decline, right? Now, whether that's generalized across all open source communities, I don't know, I just don't have the data, to be honest. Like what would cause it? For OpenStack, I think one thing that was a real strength of the community in the early days, but then maybe turned into a weakness, was a lot of people were paid to work on OpenStack full time. So the kind of the hobbyist to full-timer ratio was strongly in our favor, right? It was great because we all got to work 24/7 on OpenStack, but it was also not great because companies sometimes lose interest in things, right? And when they pull the support from it, that led to an influx of people, So maybe communities that are more based on the hobbyist volunteer ethic, they might be more resilient to that kind of thing.
Well, I think we also have a tendency as a community to ignore the fact that OpenStack's been around 15 years.
Yep.
We're not done, but we've done a lot.
Yep.
So like the need for new stuff in OpenStack has gone down considerably.
Yep.
And I actually think it's almost like a feedback loop where some of the maintenance or invisible work, plug for my talk tomorrow, that's getting ignored is also partially because there are so many more people able to go pick up the OpenStack off the shelf and just use it without ever thinking about the community. Whereas let's say in 2014 you wanted to use OpenStack, that almost guaranteed you to come with some engagement with the community to figure out how to do something or to get this feature that you might need done. But now OpenStack covers so many use cases that it's, I sort of have the mental graph of how many people I talk to who use my software who I didn't know existed.
Yeah.
And that number used to be really close to zero for Ironic. And now almost every conversation I have with someone who I've never met, yeah, we're using Ironic, we're using it great. We've never said a word to anyone who works on it.
Yeah.
And so there's some of that where, there's this model of like everyone wants to growth over growth.
Yeah.
And really at some point, we've got the core functionality locked down for a lot of this stuff. And the pieces that are getting added are niche pieces that, the average person doesn't have to engage with the community to get.
Yep, absolutely. So it's a kind of the mature, battle-hardened, battle-tested thing, right? And a lot of the missing features are, were certainly there in 2014, 2015, 2016. They've been built out now, right? So, that is fair, right? But we still have, I think, projects, like several cases of projects where they've existed in the community and then they've teetered on the edge of viability, right? And they have to be kind of brought back from the brink. So we did this recently with Watcher, for example. Like the TC were literally on the cusp of throwing the thing out because the tests weren't green and yada yada yada, right? So there are definitely resource constraints. Okay, let's jump through another few things here. If you have any ideas, by the way, as to what were the impediments, please do record them in the Etherpad. So here's where I really wanted feedback, right? What changes potentially could help here with adoption? Right? So first off, the revision that I talked about, obviously we approved that in, I think it was early July. I think it might have been the July board meeting. We voted on it. So the main change is assisted by. That seems just on the basis of the data to be adopted. The simplified kind of summary up front, that seems to have helped. There's a few other simplifications in the actual language and so on. So yeah, did anyone look at the before and after of that and have any opinions as to whether it was better or worse, whether the revision actually achieved anything? Yeah, okay. Still a lot of words.
I mean, it's
Yeah.
honestly, like when I saw this session, my entire thought was that it was misattributed.
Ah.
That it really is just a matter of timing, it's a matter of how good the tools is.
Yeah.
It's the fact that OpenStack is a particularly difficult problem. And like for me, I noticed a really sharp changeover moving to different tools as the models got better in it, going from a point of being, this is a waste of my time to this is actually a useful tool. And it happened to coincide approximately with the policy change.
Right.
And that's when, at least I was personally having more conversations with people where they're asking me how it is, and my answer switched from,
Yeah.
to, this is actually really cool, you should try it.
Yeah. So that's actually a really good point, that maybe what the board did really wasn't the crucial factor at all. It was just the tools got better, right? And the ropey nature of these tools a year or 18 months ago was essentially driving the non-use initially. That would be totally fair. Is everybody okay with the change to the DCO, by the way? Like, so that, you like, yeah, that it was a question mark as to whether the DCO will complicate this, right? Because you do have to, certify the origin of all of the stuff, right? But I think the legal kind of consensus seems to be it's fine. Like logically, you can see why it might need to be explained, but it seems to be okay. We clearly haven't had a tsunami of slop, right? Because there's been relatively few patches. Yep, Alexander?
But I actually would have a question about this. So when you showed the metrics were about patches who had assisted by tag
Yeah.
and were merged into
Yes.
the master.
Exactly.
But it feels like if we're only measuring successful cases,
Yeah.
we're losing part of information which would actually tell us whether it is or not like the risk of a slope. And one way of like improving this whole adoption thing and a better attitude in the community toward this is to make sure that we're prepared to track if something bad happens with that tsunami of slope, and that having this metric tracked, that like how many patches are created with assisted by tag but do not actually lead to substantial contributions. Like if this starts to exponentially grow as well, this is where like the moment we should be catching and say like, okay, let's talk about it. Why this is happening? What should we do about it?
Yeah, so that's a fantastic point. Yeah, please do add that to the Etherpad, right? So that was kind of, I suppose, laziness on my part that I didn't kind of do the analysis of the bigger group of patches, but you're totally right. That's what would indicate that it is actually a problem, right? If you had a lower, so there's a certain percentage of all patches at all times that are not going to get reviewer attention and we're never going to land, whether that percentage is spiked up significantly is what we're looking for here. Yeah, that's a really good point.
We also haven't had a full release yet, and patches don't always merge in the same release they're proposed. So there's possibly a lot more patches in flight that will eventually get merged that are assisted by AI.
Yeah, absolutely. Once we get the kind of one full cycle under our belts with us, I think that's a great point. Anyone got any opinions on the second last bullet point on that side? Because I honestly, when we started off in this, I thought this would be more of an issue.
It's just useless.
Yeah.
Like, I have tried so hard to get this stuff working. Look, I've got it working locally. I've tried to hook up the tools, the open source tools, and it is like, the GitHub Copilot from 3 years ago is magic compared to how bad some of the open source tools are right now. And I also will say that part of what influences my opinion about that is that what has been defined as an open source AI model does not at all match my values of what open source actually means. So the differential between an open source model as defined by places like the OSI and a commercial model are effectively nothing to me in terms of like moral and ethical.
Yeah.
I mean, just to be clear, the point is not exactly about the model, but for example, that's probably one of the limitations that I can see with that is that if you say assisted by, let's say, cursor, with cursor you have different options that you can choose about what kind of data you will gather, what kind of data then either cursor or Claude will use for giving you results. If you don't click on that specific option value, then it could create you some kind of definitely new stuff that actually it's either proprietary or kind of having some licensing issue. But basically, cursor supports that. So basically, the problem is the commercial models work pretty fine for me, sure, but we don't exactly know whether the people that use those models correctly use what they can do for making sure that they won't have any licensing issues. That's also one of the problems that I have. That's just also maybe something that we should be thinking about that. But
Yeah. So ones that like are closer to the ethics of open source, like say, was a Granite 2 that was only trained on permissively licensed code, like in the public domain, right? And yeah, I mean, it was pretty bad quality, right? And
that's the problem when you. I mean, at least for the moment, I would say that's the problem that we have. So if we basically support something like that, then you need to make sure that it works. But
yeah, absolutely. Make sure that it works. It doesn't have to be as good as Claude Code, right? But it can't be 100 times worse, right? Yeah. And then one thing that came up in a lot of the discussions around this when we were crafting the original policy was secondary matching, right? So when it was more feared that some proprietary code, would be generated by these models, they were like just spitting back, regurgitating their training set, right? That we should be checking this, right? Like I think what we ended up with in the end was an ask that contributors would check it themselves, right? But that kind of secondary matching, again, it turned out to be not so much of a thing, not as needed as I think was originally thought. Okay, this is just some kind of thoughts to take away with you, right? Very focused on code gen, obviously, right? But there are other ways we could use AI-assisted tools. So these are just a few. Curious as to whether people would be interested in any of these. I've often had a kind of feeling that one of the major barriers to people onboarding into the OpenStack projects is they're quite complicated, right? Especially the long-standing ones like Nova and Ironic. There's a lot of code there, there's a lot of drivers, there's a lot of pieces to it, right? It struck me that, some way of onboarding people by sitting down in front of an AI, getting it to explain the structure of the code base might be an accelerant to get past that initial bump, right? Maybe people do this already. In fact,
I don't do that for onboarding, I do that all the time.
There you go, right?
Like, tell me where in the code this happens.
Yeah. So that could be useful. Second bullet, I think, is more controversial. I know there's been some experimentation. Gibby did something with Sorcery, with Nova. There's a few others did it, like with CodeRabbit. So AI-assisted code review. Still with humans in the loop, right? So still has to be an actual core reviewer blessing +2. But maybe the tool gives them this bit looks a bit ropey, maybe we should change this bit, maybe, any thoughts on that?
So one of the things, I'm sorry, you go ahead, I have to talk.
I have a question on that. So we as humans, we have context, right?
Yeah.
Especially when we're talking about big code, big complex project, right?
Mm-hmm.
So far, I didn't see any of these models having the amount of knowledge sufficiently to understand the context of a big project like that, and understand that when you make a change in a specific part of a code, that could break any other part of the project outside of that specific context. So far, we need humans to do that, but I couldn't find any model that could do like AI-assisted code review to understand that and properly say, okay, this won't break anything else, we're good to go. Or not, you fix that bug, it's a specific part of the code, but that will break another part of the code right there. So how can we put guardrails on that, you know, to avoid that kind of situation to happen, and to introduce new bugs or even like revert something that was fixed in the past and now we have a new bug because of that.
So I would say, like, first thing I wanted to point out, and this goes to what you're saying a little bit, is one of the pieces of feedback from the foundation's push about people being frustrated about not getting their patches, and I don't know what the official thing is, that's what I've indexed it at in my brain, is that people don't like trickle code reviews, where like maybe someone will review the code, find a major issue, and instead of reading the next, 100 lines of the code, they'll stop reviewing.
Okay.
And that has been my major concern with AI-assisted code review of that. If you have someone who's a completely inexperienced OpenStack engineer and the AI code review goes in and tells them a bunch of BS, then that person's not going to be enabled at all to do that. So I think that's really unfriendly to other contributors. And that kind of goes to what you're saying about, like, for me, I'm not worried about guardrails around the code breaking stuff. Like, we have CI for that, right? Like, if you don't have enough CI coverage that you have confidence that code changing over here breaks over here, then you can go fix that CI first. But for me, it's more about taking someone who's maybe enthusiastic about OpenStack and just wasting their time and having those tools sucked away from them. Like, as a code reviewer, I'm not as worried about sloppy AI code because I look at the sloppy AI code, I know it's sloppy AI code, and I just move on.
Yeah.
But I'm paid to do it. I'm not, someone on a weekend trying to enhance something who might have had 2 hours of their time wasted by something we were piloting because a human will prevent it from breaking the project. Like, it's kind of disrespectful of other people's time to force those tools upon them in ways of like AI-assisted code review.
You can have AI-assisted code review in the same way as AI-assisted code explanation. Someone can use that as a tool when they're reviewing code, and it helps to onboard like new people and encourage them to like actually review the code because they have an assistant next to them that can say, well, that's what this does.
Yeah.
Instead of you asking the questions and going and looking for the answers yourself and taking the 2 hours, you'll get a 5-minute overview of what this person who is submitting code review or a code change is actually trying to do. So it can help you help yourself when you're learning.
So the difference there is automated AI review being posted to the code review versus, hey, I'm looking at this code review and using my local AI to look at it.
It's kind of like an overloaded term because there's different parts of it.
You're doing it locally, not automatic, not just pushing an AI review out.
And really, you can do that today. I've done it today. I've seen other ironic people do it today. I do it for most code that I write that's of any size before I push it. Like, I mean, there's a lot of these tools, I think, lose some of the distastefulness that they put in other people's mouths if you don't force it upon them. If you allow people to pull in and use those tools if that's the tools they're comfortable with. But if someone doesn't want to use a power drill, let them use a screwdriver. That's not my decision, that's theirs. What I care about is the code that comes out the end.
Maybe they like the process of using the screwdriver over the power drill.
Yeah. And to Emma's point, like, I think, if you're really going to do the job of a code reviewer well, you really got to try and get into the headspace of the intent that the person had in what they're trying to achieve, right? And why they constructed the patch in this way, right? And certainly, when I was doing code review, that's the piece I found the most challenging and most time consuming, right? So if you get a kind of steal a jump on that phase, right, that would definitely be nice and productive, right? Then we got all the housekeeping stuff, right? The less glamorous side of running an open source project, right? So housekeeping, project management, being a kind of a PTL, whatever it is, right? Being a liaison with one of the cost-cutting groups, right? There's quite a lot of paperwork involved there, right? Maybe some of that paperwork could be sped up, right? Things like triaging bugs, doing release management. I don't know if any of the upstream projects do any kind of agile sizing. Certainly a lot of downstream teams do. That takes time, that takes thought, cognitive load. If you could get an AI to help you with that or suggest an initial size. Right?
Especially when you have a large team that has a particular format that they need for your tickets to be in, but everybody thinks a little bit differently and lays things out differently, converting from how you think to how it's expected to be. That's a really tedious part because sometimes you can throw it out very quickly and have something imagined or rationalized in your head, and then you spend 2 hours trying to get the right fields filled in.
Yeah, absolutely. And any others, right? So again, throw your thoughts into the Etherpad, please. like, I think we do have like a bit of a blinkered focus on code gen, right? Because kind of that's our stock and trade, right? It's an open source community, right? But there are probably other vectors for, you know, not necessarily kind of overusing AI just for the sake of using it, but like real productivity gains, right? That could translate into just a higher throughput of work, right? And that's essentially that's my entire interest in this, right?
I mean, there is already some action item from the E18M team. We discussed that in Korea because, for example, for the docs, most of them are not translating because they need people to translate them. So one of the action items that they had, but because of the Zanata migration that they had to do, they were blocked. So now that the Zanata migration is actually done, they should be starting it. Should be like using AI tools to help them translating all the docs that were in our products. So that would definitely help other contributors, not specifically English speakers, to be able to basically understand exactly what we're saying. That includes like the project documentations, etc., and so on and so forth. So that's one of the actions that we know that's coming in. We just need to find people to do that. But that seems to be like a consensus that we have, and a good way forward to just improve our contributor base by using AI.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, please put that in the Etherpad as well.
Yeah,
so,
I'll mention that,
you know, I suspect that a lot of non-English speaking contributors are already doing that themselves, right? You know, they're kind of running things through Google Translate or whatever, and have been for quite a long time. But doing that for them, right? So the getting started guide is in, you know, Mandarin as well as English or whatever it is. That's certainly something that could have value. Cool. Okay, so that's kind of it, really. Thanks for the time, the attention. I know it's the end of the day, right? So the energy levels are probably flagging. We're definitely good engagement. If you have any ideas after the fact, right, stick them in the Etherpad, right? And I'll definitely do a kind of a summary of anything that pops up there. Bring it back to the board. We'll probably be looking at this data again, I would say, in maybe a cycle down the road. Certainly take, Alexandra, your suggestion on board, and mind that there might be a bit of a survivorship bias, I think, right, in the data I've looked at so far, right? So look at the things that didn't actually succeed, right, but were thrown up against the wall and just didn't stick. Yep.
Thank you, Eoghan, and I think it's interesting to revisit that at next summit, because the technology is moving so fast that some of the things that today we say, it's crap and it's not working, code review, things like that, it's moving exponentially. So 6 months from now, a year from now, I always tell people, we were joking 3 years ago. Like everybody was laughing at how bad it was, and today people lose their job to it. So we don't know where we'll be a year from now. So I think it's a session that would be worth revisiting 6 months, a year, because we don't know what will come out.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to me. I sort of took inventory of the tools when they were Copilot era. It was very bad. I revisited a couple of times, and then I had a guy on my team who's a PhD student, part-time open stacker, who literally sat down with me in a one-on-one and was like, you need to look at how much better these tools are. And by walking me through and showing me the quality of tools and giving me 3 bullet points of advice, it switched it from something that I was discarding out of hand to something that's become a day-to-day part of my workflow. Yeah. I would be interested in the statistic of when was the last time I pushed a patch that didn't have assisted by labeled on it, because even for minor stuff, I'll use Claude as almost an interactive way to deal with it.
Yeah.
Along the lines of other ways to leverage AI, and I purposely want to say this out loud because I know you work with the foundation, and this is a needle that the foundation can maybe help move. Is I know that there are a lot of people who use these tools who have personal repositories with things like a Claude MD or an Agent MD or stuff like that. We even had talk in Ironic of putting some of those in there, but one of the big impediments is that there's no standard naming for those. So I looked it up, and you would have to have your file symlinked to no less than 4 or 5 different names if you wanted it to be truly agnostic. If you wanted everything from Claude to Google to all this stuff to read it, you have to pick the different name that each one of them does. And if there could be a standard there, or something, if we could get them to agree to just read the same dang file name for context, then it opens up the possibility for us to really make these tools more useful for someone who just checks out our repository and tries to do a thing.
So you would kind of envisage a case where we would have that .md file, whatever, as an example, right?
Or committed, just have a claw.md in the root of the repo
Yeah.
for projects that would like to do that.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to commit a claw.md.
Yeah.
I'm going to knack an agent.md. I'm going to knack any of these that are company specific unless we're going to symlink it everywhere, because we shouldn't favor one over the other, especially if they're not open source.
Yeah, absolutely. So you just throw that in a contrib directory or whatever, and you use it if you want to, or ignore it if you don't care. But
I wouldn't put it in the contrib directory for technical reasons, but yes.
Right. Yeah. No, that's a really good idea. Now, I don't know how much influence we have over those tools vendors, right? But certainly it would make everyone's life easier if there was more standing.
You can just do it at like the executive foundation board country club visits that y'all do all the time, I'm sure.
I'm not invited. If there's any country clubs being visited, my invite was lost in the mail. I'll probably just Jonathan and Mark do those things. Cool. Okay, thank you all. Much appreciated the time and the attention. And again, anything adverse over the next day or two related to this topic, throw in the Etherpad, and I'll do some of
There was something that we haven't discussed that I just mentioned, but communication is the key.
Yeah.
Because I wonder how many people here know that there are some assisted tag that they could use, because it's not maybe a trust problem, it's just maybe a knowledge problem that probably we should be just fixing by basically telling them that something is existing just for notifying that, and that relates to that also relates to the more people starting using that tag, then the less confusion it will be. So maybe just communicating that should be helpful. So
I actually can't remember how or if we communicated it properly, like whether it just went on OpenStack this cluster or whatever.
That's my concern. I mean, that's probably something. I mean, I don't know. That's probably something we should discuss. As CC members, maybe trying to find a way to communicate a bit further about that, just during regular feedback, remembering people that that's not something that we enforce. Given we don't enforce that, people are not tend to use it, right? So that's probably just that. So we will see anyway by communicating if that helps.
Yep. Cool. Thank you, Sylvain. Cool. Thank you all. We'll call it a wrap.
They're picking up from the member that from not.
Yep.
So if you're going into the foundation,